One APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Concili Incorporated is Nevada's premier Democratic campaign firm. Fighting for progressive issues and candidates for over a decade, and proud sponsor of Battle-Born Progress. Tonight's episode of Out in Front is brought to you by our season sponsors, Concili Inc., Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt. As well as our episode sponsors, Save Lives Nevada and Washoe Education Association.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to Out in Front with Annette. My name is Annette Magnus, and I'm the Executive Director of Battle-Born Progress. It's so great to have you this evening. I'm joining you from beautiful Denver this evening. I'm here for a healthcare conference, but wanted to make sure we still went out in front with today's news. So we are talking all things innovation zones tonight. What the problem is with innovation zones are, an innovation zone even is, because I'm still a little fuzzy on the matter, and how we should be kind of thinking about this concept as we move forward in the state of Nevada. So I have a few fabulous experts to join me here tonight to talk about this and what's been transpiring today, because there was big news. Blockchains LLC is pulling their proposal in Nevada, supposedly, in Storey County. And so we're going to talk about what that means and more in just a few minutes. So I want to introduce our distinguished panel of guests this evening. The first person who I'm very proud to have joining us is Storey County Commissioner Clay Mitchell. Thank you. I also want to introduce Shari Whalen, General Manager at TRI General Improvement District. Sarah Adler, who generously helped me put this panel together, from Silver State Government Relations, and Will Adler, Silver State Government Relations as well, and also maybe Sarah's son. So thank you all for joining us. And Sarah, I want to kick it over to you first, because I wanted you to explain what is an innovation zone and what does that mean? Because I know a lot of Nevadans are still very confused about this concept. So Sarah, take it away.
Maybe unmute.
And Sarah, make sure you unmute.
First time for everything. All right. So, Annette, thank you so much. I am pleased to be with you tonight, and as is the whole team here that's joining us. I'm going to bring up a very brief presentation that was created a little bit before today's announcement, but it will still help your guests see exactly what an innovation zone is. So, as you're aware, as I think everyone is aware, the governor announced in his State of the State address in January that he was going to be a proponent of the concept of an innovation zone. That being that an applicant who was willing to, who had control of 50,000 or more acres with no people living in it, would be able to, after showing $1 billion, an application that asserted the ability to create $1 billion of investment, would be allowed to form essentially its own county, this innovation zone. One of the key features of that was that the governor would be selecting the 3-member, they were going to call it Board of Supervisors, but 2 of those members had to be taken from a list provided by the applicant. So that, and of course, the purpose of this innovation zone was to attract innovative companies, allow the blossoming of innovative technology. And as you'll hear from Storey County, choose to adopt county functions as it developed. It was in their choice as to when to adopt public health, safety, voting, for example, justice functions. So, and this is something that could have happened anywhere in our state, but as we know, Blockchains LLC, which became Blockchains Inc., had bought that teal property with the yellow outlines that you see on the screen there in Storey County. And if you look at it in relationship to Reno Sparks, that's about as much property as they were proposing to place into an innovation zone. If you move south, how big would that have been in Southern Nevada? About this big. So we see proposing to control an enormous amount of territory. In contrast, Storey County, whom Will and I are proud to represent, had put forward, have you heard, Mr. Blockchains, of the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, this public-private partnership that has been established in Storey County with great success? This is a partnership that is rooted in a development agreement that has stood up since the year 2000. And it has had terrific success in job growth in high value professions at a wage that is much higher than the average wage in Nevada. And so Storey County's argument isn't they're in favor of technology, not in favor of autonomous government. This slide just shows you the complexity of being a local government and the amount of interactions that are necessary on a regional basis, just to demonstrate a little bit of the strength that an applicant should be able to show. I mean, if someone's going to take this on. I personally work closely with Tri General Improvement District, the GID, who had communicated consistently and clearly with Blockchains about the problems within the bill draft request that became the subject of the special committee and the ways in which it would prevent the GID from performing its responsibilities. As we know, Blockchains wanted to create a smart city. There is a area out in the northeast corner of Storey County called Painted Rock, where that smart city, this was their rendering of their smart city, was proposed to be located. There are, of course, natural resource issues related to that. And what Storey County said is, great, our master plan allows for residential development in Storey County. Would you please get on it and submit an application? So that's the message from Storey County. Let's not fix something that is not broken. And as you will share with us, Annette, Blockchain had something to say today. But that's the overview of what an innovation zone was proposed to be and how it would have looked in Storey County. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I want to bring in Commissioner Mitchell. So there was news today that Blockchains LLC has decided to withdraw their application for various reasons from Storey County. Talk to us about what that, feels like as somebody who's been incredibly consistent on this issue. Storey County has been out there pushing back on this issue. And like Sarah said, simply submitting an application and going through the normal process. If a business wants to come to your area, that's the way we probably should have done this.
Yeah, thank you, Annette. I think the news that we had today was that they were not going to pursue this anymore, but they are still the largest landholder in our county. The 67,000 acres that they own represents about 40% of the land area of Storey County. And the position that we took was fairly nuanced. And I mentioned this in the last hearing. I said, look, we've been described as the opposition to this, but it's not really reflective of our position, because we're supportive of innovative technologies. We're supportive of looking at, is there a way to implement blockchain technology and potentially cryptocurrency to make us more efficient, more equitable, more whatever that looks like. We are open to the type of development, both residential and commercial, that they were talking about. We just felt that there was not a need to create a new political subdivision to do that. And so where it goes from here, the door is certainly still open. We our case that we've been making is that they should work with us instead of around us. And I think that continues to be our position. We would love to work with them. Obviously, there are some things that they think either we're not able to provide or not able to provide effectively. But I think that as a local government entity, we're kind of the right place to start with that discussion. And then if there are things that we're not able to provide, then we can take that to the legislature, we can take it to the state level and have that discussion, but in a more focused way on what those particular items might be.
You know, I testified at the Nevada legislature against this because I have seen scams before in the Nevada legislature. And my whole job is to call out things when I see them that I believe are scams. And, I think for me, what was troubling about this is they couldn't articulate to us what they plan to innovate. They just kept saying they were innovating things, which is great. I appreciate that. But, I'm all for bringing a new business to Nevada, but at what cost? And creating its own political district, essentially, setting up its own autonomous government outside of our state structure. How are our public employees going to be paid? How are our teachers going to be paid? How are they going to fund roads? All of the things that it takes to run a county or a city. And it would basically skirt the rules that Storey County has set up for themselves and create its own county. Talk to me about why that is so dangerous, especially for a smaller rural county like you all.
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, Annette, we, as a rural county, we take a pretty light touch as far as government goes. But that being said, local government plays a very important role with some checks and balances in place. And we think that we've put some pretty innovative agreements and structures in place that allow us to move quickly, but not to cut corners, and to make sure that there are proper safeguards in place. I thought that our county team did a really good job of laying out a few of those specific concerns, and I'll give you just a couple of examples. If we had a separate government entity that we were required to provide services to within the county, within the boundaries of the county, now we have our sheriff's deputies potentially having to enforce two different sets of laws. Because the requirements were that the property be contiguous, that would have left little islands of Storey County isolated out here. So now we're having to cross another jurisdiction to go service those areas. Certainly doable, but one of the concerns that our fire chief had is he said, if we don't have control over permitting and inspections for safety and for fire prevention, then if our guys have to go in and fight a fire, they don't necessarily know if things are where they expect them to be, if things have been done right. One of the biggest challenges is the idea that they would be able to phase in the different local government services. And so for us, for example, to cover a new community with police services, you can't just hire one or two more deputies. You're going to have to hire half a dozen and maybe build a jail and maybe whatever it is, you have to invest up front. Same for the schools. They could start taking on a lot of that autonomy at 100 residents, 100 voters. That's the way the proposal was written. So we would potentially have to provide schooling for a handful of children. And then what happens, we build a small school for them, and then what happens with that? And so there was just in the mechanics of it, it was a bit challenging. I want to be clear, I'm a new commissioner. I've been on the job about 9 months. I met Mr. Burns from Blockchains when I was campaigning, and I happen to be a cryptocurrency geek, right? I mine cryptocurrency. I'm an advocate. I invest in it. And I think that he really has some ideas that have merit as far as ways to use innovative technology to better people's lives, to secure their sovereignty, to secure their, their privacy from big tech, and I just didn't hear, as you know, I didn't hear anything in what they presented that required them to work outside of the existing structures. And maybe there is something, but we didn't get to that point in the conversation. I'd love to still have the conversation because I think that I think there are positives and really transformative elements to what they're proposing.
Absolutely. And, on face value, I don't think any of us are opposed to bringing new businesses to Nevada if they're paying their fair share, if they're setting their systems up the way that everybody else has to set their systems up, if they're playing by the same rule book as the rest of us have to play by. And I think that's really where my issue came in with this is, number one, this isn't just for blockchains, this is for all these businesses. If you're going to come to Nevada, you should have to pay your fair share in taxes, because we have to pay for those services and fees and good governance and all of those things. But in addition to that, I think what this sets up is this new version of a company town is kind of what I was envisioning, because we've seen this around the country before and it didn't work. So I guess my question to you is, I believe Storey County's been very consistent on this issue and asking to see things and asking for transparency and asking for them to go through the proper process. So what has the history been on this, and how did we get here, Commissioner?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as I said, I'm the new guy. I was not involved in the initial conversations. Blockchains bought this property in 2018, early 2018. And there were some preliminary discussions with county officials at the time. I'm not privy to the specifics of those because there were non-disclosure agreements signed and people are keeping to those. But my understanding is that blockchains came away from those meetings with a conclusion that Storey County was not open to these things. Now, that may or may not have been the case. I don't really know. But anyone who is wanting to do a project, a development, do something like this, since that time, 2 out of the 3 commission seats in our county have changed over, and we have a new county manager. And for anyone who's serious about doing any sort of development, to not keep track of the political landscape, to not kind of keep in touch or have conversations with new leadership, because I think they would have found both myself and the other commissioner that took office 2 years before me, we beat incumbents. And so what that shows to me is an openness to change from the electorate. And I was pretty frustrated because, like I said, I met Mr. Burns over the summer, and it sounds like that's about the time they started working on this idea. I expressed an interest and an enthusiasm for what they were working on. And then they worked on it for 6 months and rolled it out following the state of the state. And we really had no additional conversation in that regard. So I think, I'm working very hard to make sure that door is still open, because I do believe that there is a path forward, and I really hope so. Because again, I'm excited about some of the things, even down to the concept of some direct democracy experiments where maybe we're using new technology for people to weigh in on local decisions. That's a really interesting concept. It's a very populist concept, and something that I think rightly could be explored in a controlled setting. But again, it has to be done the right way. We have to make sure there are proper safeguards in place.
Absolutely. So just a couple of questions from our audience, and I know you have to go at 5:30, but Will asks, I saw it reported that Blockchain still owns the deed to the water under Pyramid Lake and surrounding area. Is this true? And if so, can the Pyramid Lake Paiute regain the rights to the water? And I know this has been a big issue around water rights. How are they going to get the needed water for this development? I know water is obviously an issue for you all up north, like it is down south. So how is that going to be addressed? And I think a bigger issue is, why wasn't the tribal community consulted on this before this happened? And Will, I'm going to ask you about this too in a little bit.
Yeah, we have a panel of experts that are much more acquainted with that aspect of things, and I'll let them deal with that. But to lay kind of the groundwork for the water discussion, the water rights that they had acquired an interest in, I don't know if they actually purchased them or just had a right to purchase them, were from an area fairly far north of here, the San Emilio Basin, which is about 100 miles. And so it's actually the other side of Pyramid Lake. And they would have to bring, now, there certainly is an argument that could be made that some of that groundwater feeds into the Pyramid Lake Basin. And so it's complex, as Mark Twain reportedly said, water's for fighting over and whiskey's for drinking, right? So the idea is that certainly the water question is something that needs to be addressed. From a county perspective, our approvals for development is conditioned on acquiring water rights and then showing that they can actually be delivered to the property. And so we don't necessarily get into the weeds on how that's going to happen. It's just, we make sure that they handle that with the proper authorities and with the owners of those rights. I think there's, blockchains talked a lot about how building a purposeful city that's high density, that's walkable, that's kind of a new urbanism approach, has the potential to be much more efficient from a water perspective. But the reality is, certainly that's a question that needs to be answered before you move 35,000 new people into the desert. And there certainly isn't enough groundwater where they were talking about building the city to support a development of that size.
Yeah, I also, and there's a lot of comments coming in, people are very fired up about this topic. One of the things that I read in the letter that Blockchains put out today was about the wild horse issue. And, if you've lived in Nevada for any amount of time, I've lived here my whole life, that wild horses is a huge issue here in the state. A lot of people see them as, part of the West, but we also know they're an invasive species and, can be very detrimental to the land. And so, you've got this kind of weird mix of loving the beauty of the wild horse, but at the same time, they can actually hurt things. And so, we know that on the land that Blockchains owns, there's quite a few wild horses. So talk to us a little bit about that issue and just generally the issue of wild horses in Storey County and how that played into this entire issue.
Sure. So, and I want to be clear, even though the entirety of what was envisioned as the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, including what Blockchains owns, is over 100,000 acres, it's not densely developed. You have fairly good sized buildings or businesses, but there's a lot of open space between them. And a lot of it isn't even developable. In fact, there are mountain goat habitats. There's some mountains around that are not at all developable, and they're not intended to be. They're intended to leave that space. So Blockchains, as well as several other companies, have been really good corporate citizens in working on the horse issue. And a lot of those efforts have been led by the developers of the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center. They work with the wild horse groups. One of the programs that they're working with is a darting program. So it's contraception. And the idea is that it's done humanely. It's done. I've gone through some presentations from those groups in a way so that the population doesn't overwhelm. As you said, it's a delicate balance, and they can take away habitat. The horses, if they develop too big a population, can hurt the habitat of other animals that they share the range with. And so that's something that several of the companies out there are very active with supporting and monitoring, providing water in places that are going to encourage the horses not to cross busy roadways and interact. Certainly there are safety issues. And so all of that's part of whenever we have a special use permit for a new company coming in, which admittedly isn't very often in Tahoe Reno Industrial Center. That's an expedited process, but that's a conversation that happens. And people ask, what are you going to do about the wild horses? How do we coexist properly? I don't, in and of itself, I don't know if it has a direct impact on the idea of an innovation zone, but I've been fairly pleased with a good number of the companies out there and their efforts to try to find that right balance where we respect the natural environment that they're moving into.
Yeah, and one of the questions I actually had along the same lines, and I've actually never had a chance to ask anybody about it. What about sage grouse habitat? Because that's another species that we're trying to obviously protect. It's a very important species to Nevadans, for hunting, for recreation, for our ecosystems. They're, incredibly important. So how would that have played into all of this, especially knowing that sage grouse habitat has been disproportionately impacted by things like climate change and things like that?
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on specifically within Storey County. My understanding is that we have a less sage grouse habitat within Storey County than a lot of the other rural areas of the state, but certainly that's part of the balance. I don't necessarily see direct opposition between conservation efforts and a development like this because it's a concentrated, high density development idea. And so the residential portion of the 67,000 acres would be somewhere in the 2,000 to 2,500 acre range, but it would be very compact. And then certainly there's talk about commercial and industrial development, research and development campuses and things. But I see this for the most part as a fairly responsible proposal when it comes to land use and preserving habitat overall.
Yeah, I guess my issue with it was when we were kind of first talking about this is, they approached environmental groups and groups like mine after the fact, after the state of the state, after this had already been put into place. So rather than doing their due diligence ahead of time and having these conversations with tribal leaders and folks like that, and environmental leaders, it was just kind of like, well, here it is, take it or leave it. Oh, by the way, we think it's going to be okay for the environment. We think it's going to be okay for this, this, and this. And I think to me, it was also the approach of this, right? Not listening to the government officials, the county officials, not respecting the county officials, not respecting the tribal leadership, not respecting the, folks on the ground who really have a stake in this, and it's your community. And so that, I think, is where my issue comes in, is the kind of just forging forward, even though people are asking them to stop, slow down, have a real conversation.
Yeah, and I think there was some feeling of that as well. In Storey County, we have about 4,500 residents, and they're split between 4 kind of distinct communities. And one of the offers that we made to blockchains was they expressed a kind of a hesitance or a suspicion that that we could make assurances to them, but then if people voted in new commissioners or there was a changeover, that they wouldn't have the stability to keep going with the project. And we said, first of all, the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center has, as Sarah mentioned, there's a development agreement in place that's been in there for 20 years, and it locks in place the terms, the fees, the conditions, and it gives that stability to say, we're not going to pull the rug out from under you. We're not going to change things. We're going to continue with the agreement that's in place. And so that's an example of something we've done to provide some stability. But we also offered and said, if you'd like to come and test and present your ideas and see what the local populace thinks about them and the decision makers, we were ready to schedule a joint meeting of the county commission and the planning commission, publicly noticed, so that everyone could have their say, everyone could kind of talk about it out loud. And I'm a little disappointed that didn't happen, because that's a pretty unique opportunity. It's something you don't get to do in every jurisdiction, but being a small place, it's something we can do. And you're right. I've gained an appreciation recently of the role that each of the different stakeholder groups plays, especially in a state with a part-time legislature. We can't expect our legislators to be experts on everything. And so advocacy groups and local governments, they play a really crucial role in coming up with better solutions, better legislation, because that give and take and that tug, while it may be a little messy, it helps us suss out, vet out the issues, and get to a better place and a better outcome. So I think you're right.
And that's how democracy is supposed to work, right? That's the whole point of having a democracy, is give and take. You have different sides of an issue, you debate those issues respectfully, and you come to some sort of agreement that usually nobody likes, and that's usually how legislation gets made, right? That's the whole point of democracy. And I think that was the part for me, the biggest part that was missing out of this, was that give and take. It was really just we're going to take this and you're going to accept it. And that never sits well with me, ever. So
Yeah.
one
I think
last
you're right.
question for you, Commissioner. Yeah, one last question for you, Commissioner, from our audience, and then we'll let you hop. So Maria, and you kind of started to answer this a little bit, but maybe you can go into more detail. Maria asks, I heard during the hearing that local governments would still have to provide services to this zone, even though it was autonomous. Why is it that they want their own government then?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are two pieces to the local government providing services, and that would be during a transitionary period. And so that basically they would not be without essential services while they were getting up and running. And then there were benchmarks where they could notify the host county that they were going to start providing those services as they gained residents. And then at a certain point, for example, as when they had 100 voters, then at that point they would take over things like elections and provide those locally. So there are a couple of reasons that the proposal was structured that way. And the first one goes back to Bullfrog County. And Bullfrog County was an example where it has to do with Yucca Mountain nuclear waste. And it was actually a subdivision of Nye County, and it was a state's effort to impede the federal government from coming in and forcing it to take this waste. And they basically said, what we're going to do is we're just going to tax the heck out of it, and no one lives there, and so they don't, it's fine. They'll be the only ones that will have to deal with this. That was overturned by the state Supreme Court because the Constitution of Nevada says that if you are charged of a felony, you need to be tried in the county where the crime happened, and with no residents, they couldn't seat a jury. And so this was a way to get around that legal issue, because you would still have those services provided by the host county up until the point where they were able to take them on. As far as your question about why they would want their own government, specifically, I mentioned one part. They were worried that it would either be a burden on the host county and we wouldn't be able to keep up with what they wanted to do, or it would be too expensive for us to integrate the things they wanted to do. They also were saying they didn't want to impose the new ideas they had onto existing residents. And so getting that autonomy gives them some separation there. And finally, having the guarantee, if you will, that they would be able to continue with the whole project, having the planning and permitting and trying to do things in a new way. There's a lot of trial and error there, and there's a substantial amount of failure that's going to happen. You're going to fail as you're trying new things. And they saw that as incompatible with the role of traditional government, that we would be more risk averse. And so those, I think, were the main reasons that they wanted autonomy. And my response to that is, there are levels of autonomy that we can discuss within existing structures, whether that's a GID, a general improvement district, where they would be able to take on some service, providing some services, and vote for a board for that. There's law that allows for unincorporated towns or even incorporated cities. Those are all existing structures where the county would remain as an underpinning and with proper responsibilities and oversight roles, but then would give them the flexibility to do some of the things they wanted to do. And those are things, unfortunately, we didn't really get to delve into in the study, but are probably worth considering, because I have a feeling that ideas like this are probably going to keep coming around. Doesn't make them any better, but they're probably not the only ones that want to do this.
Yeah, and that's why we kept this episode, even though they put their letter in to take this away, is people need to know this is something, is not just a concept that is, one and done. This is something that's going to keep coming back, and people really need to understand what's at stake here. And as somebody who lives in a general improvement district, in double HOAs, in a place where I have a board, but I also live in a county and Clark County governs me. It can be done. I live in a master plan community that was built in the early 2000s, and they have services and parks and things that were built under that plan, but also it's still governed by Clark County. We all follow the same rules. And that, I guess, for me is the biggest thing is, I'd love my own county. Like, let's do this. I could go there and do whatever I want. Sounds great. But that's not reality. And I think all of us have to follow the same rules, and we have to play by the same rules, and we all should be paying our fair share. And I think that's, again, the part that really boggled my mind about this whole thing.
Yeah, well, and Annette, there's a bigger conversation to be had about how we attract business. Certainly, here in the North, we've been able to diversify to a great extent, but there have been a lot of abatements given out. We're absorbing 100% abatements on the Gigafactory for 10 years and in some cases for 20 years. And so certainly that's a conversation that's worth having, and a conversation about regional impacts. We've been pretty free and easy about approving these businesses, but certainly we should look at what's the impact of surrounding jurisdictions. And are there other ways to attract businesses that don't necessarily end up in them not paying their fair share? And we may have differing definitions of what that is, but certainly they need to be part of the community. And I think some of the things we've done may be worth looking at as well, coming up with agreements that streamline the process, again, not to cut corners, but to make sure that people can get through that process easily and quickly, and so that we check all the boxes, we make sure it's done right, and that has value to companies, and so that is attractive even if you're not giving up tax revenue.
Absolutely. And I think the other value to companies is consistency, right? Having one consistent process, companies can, those things are consistent, and that those rules are consistent, so that when a business comes here, they know the rules that they're playing.
You're absolutely right. I think I saw a question here if there are any other IZ proposals. I'm not familiar with any, but I do know that I talked to one of your commissioners recently, and they had been approached by several people who were interested, which I can't blame them. It doesn't mean it's a good idea for sure.
Yeah. Well, we'll be right there to oppose it again. Well, thank you, Commissioner, for joining us. And thank you for spending some time with us tonight. And you're always welcome on the show. Thank you for coming to talk to us about Storey County. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. I want to bring in the rest of our guests. Will, Sarah, Shari, come on in. Thank you for joining us. Shari, I'm going to start with you, actually, because you've done a lot of research on this topic, and you have a lot to say on this. So I'm going to ask you the first question. What is the TRI General Improvement District, and what does that mean?
Okay, so the TRI General Improvement District is the water and sewer utility that provides service to the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center and the surrounding area in Storey County. So we were established in 2000 under NRS 318 by the Storey County Board of County Commissioners to specifically provide water and sewer service. And now we're working on a reclaimed water system regionally to provide water to those customers, or to provide that utility to those customers in the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center. That includes folks like, Walmart and Tesla, Tire Rack. I mean, we just have, quite a few really sort of unique industrial and commercial customers. What the General Improvement District is not supposed to be doing is providing water or sewer service to residential customers. And that was kind of one of the big issues that we had to deal with through the process with the innovation zone legislation.
So Sarah, I'm going to bring you in for this question, then we'll move to Shari for this as well. So what disruption of public and economic development responsibilities would we have seen potentially with this proposal?
My 2 cents on that, why add confusion to a process that's working well. Now, as the commissioner talked about, and as for example, Assemblywoman Teresa Benitez Thompson has brought up, is a good question to look at our abatement structure. And again, the state gave abatements that landed on Storey County, but we have, as you keep saying, Annette, a set of rules, and that's what customers need is certainty. What businesses looking at Nevada need is certainty, and they need what's in statute. And to put forward something like a jurisdiction that may adopt police or may create a school district where your kids may be living, that's not the kind of certainty that attracts quality to Nevada, in my estimation.
Shari, same question for you. What could the potential disruption of the public or economic development responsibilities, what could we have seen potentially with this proposal, and what were you worried about?
So a couple of the big concerns we had with the district was that our service plan allows for commercial and industrial development, but not residential development. And it's pretty innovative when you think about sort of the conflict sometimes that happens with residential areas versus heavy industrial areas. And so that basically has been totally mitigated because there's not residential development within the service area for the district. So there's a lot of ease of development, and that's attractive to our customers. One of the big concerns that we had was the legislation that was proposed would have allowed for the innovation zone to basically take over governance of the district. And depending on how you read that legislation, it meant that somebody who didn't even live in the area, could be folks, in Clark County or, on the eastern part of our state, could have been making decisions about the rates that our customers pay, and decisions on how we fund our capital improvements. So really, it could impact day-to-day operations in a way to the detriment of our existing customers. So that was a big concern. And then another thing that is not always very popular is the power of eminent domain that the district has under NRS 318. So that we would actually lose the power of condemnation within our service area in the innovation zone. And we had islands in our service area that would have been effectively, we would not have been able to serve them because we wouldn't have been able to condemn property in the event that the innovation zone did not want to grant an easement across that land. So there were, some pretty serious potential impacts to our existing and future customers with the legislation as well.
So Sarah, before I go to Will, I just kind of want to circle up on this point, because I do think it's important. A lot of people were texting me today saying, oh, you have this innovation zones out in front tonight. Why are you still doing it? The proposal is gone. But, as the county commissioner just said, it's not gone. It can come back in other forms where they're shopping this around to other counties. Other businesses are shopping these types of things around. Why is this something Nevadans should continue to be vigilant about? And why does this matter?
Yeah, so putting on my Nevadan hat, I think it was an unserious approach to governance, and that fundamentally Nevadans have a right to public health, to safety, to education, to transportation, to elections, to the right to vote, to representative democracy. And this proposal really demonstrated, in my mind, not a serious commitment to any of that, and no guarantee to a reasonable transfer of power. When would the Innovation County take on these functions? That kind of uncertainty is unnecessary and inappropriate. So that was my concern about it as a Nevadan. And my husband's an attorney. He brought up the same thing. With 100 people living in the county, you can't seat a jury for, you wouldn't have been able to have a jury of your peers if there were a crime committed in that county with 100 or fewer people in it. So it's a problem.
Yes, it is. All right, Will, I want to bring you in on this. I know you have worked with the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribal community for a long time. As I said before, I am not aware, and everything that they have told me is that they were not consulted before this happened. And I think of all of the stuff that we've talked about tonight that has, made me question this, I think that is actually the part that chapped my ass the most about this proposal, was that the people who actually are the stewards of that land were not consulted before this happened. So talk to us about where the tribal community is on this.
Thank you, Annette. I am Will Adler with Storey State Government Relations as well. We've been representing both Storey County, TRI-GID, and the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe on this subject throughout the legislative session. So we sort of hit it on all angles and with all cylinders in the anti-innovation zone lane this session. In general, as you said, and as the questions came up earlier, the region itself is one that's kind of hard to balance or hard to keep in balance. And Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe is essentially the anchor of the river, right? The lake, is filled up from Tahoe essentially because Tahoe exits the river down the Truckee River out of Tahoe through Reno Sparks, right, out to Pyramid Lake. There's an offshoot to Fallon where you do get an agricultural canal to Fallon to feed them their water supply. But ultimately, the terminal exit of Truckee River is Pyramid Lake. And as such, they're ultimately the ones who get screwed at the end of the day if the water balance doesn't work out before the end, right? Because if somebody takes out upriver from you, there isn't going to be a replacement supply just magically flown in for the guys at the end of the river. So Pyramid Lake always takes this stance of show us where their water's at first, or show us how this will not impact the current balance in the river first. Because Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, as many of your members may know, is a federally recognized Native American tribe, and they did have to fight for their sovereignty and these protected water rights that they have today back in the 1960s and forward through lawsuits and a lawsuit on the Endangered Species Act for the cutthroat trout and the kiwi, the two endangered fish that are in the lake. Those fish essentially give them a mandatory water right from the federal government to make sure that those fish and the cultural heritage of the lake are maintained in perpetuity in the future. So, in normal speak, this means they must get the water they're supposed to get at the end of the year every year. And if they do not, they have every right to throw up their hands, sue, or cause a fuss. This creates a huge balance agreement for Reno, Truckee River, Tumwa, and everyone in the whole balance there. And this is something that is crucially for this innovation zone project and for the blockchain project important, because between Reno Sparks and the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe would be this project, the new innovation zone project sited on Painted Rocks or somewhere around Tahoe Reno Industrial Center. As Shari Whalen has said and does supply, the current supply of water in the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center is actually non-residential and is actually used only for industrial purposes from that GID. And that GID is the only current user of water out there and the current supplier of water. So this whole residential formula, this whole tech city, this whole blockchains, oasis in the desert is an unaccounted for water debt on the river. And if you don't know where that water's coming from, you have a hole in your balance coming to the end to the tribe. So essentially, this entire plan needs to be thought of ahead of time, and you need to know the impacts and the use of water ahead of time before you would approve such a project. But this whole bill and everything around it changed that precedent, and for the worse for Nevada. And it was one of the reasons why the tribe and many others stepped up and said it could not go forward, was just the language written in the bill would change that water law in Nevada forever, essentially.
Yeah, and we don't have a great history with water law, so
No.
we probably don't need to go down that road. And, I just want to kind of double down on this point. Well, my friend Steve Sebelius texted me because he's watching, and he said, why in the world would they not do as you said and talk to the county, the tribes, etc. early on?
It is a failing of this project, if you ask me, and maybe the greatest failure of this project is you cannot do things in a vacuum in any state, in any county, let alone in any part of Nevada. And that appears to be the attempt here, was just to do it on their own, do it by themselves, and to essentially go forward and say, we don't need to work with the locals. We have a better idea than any of them could understand. But that showed a deafness and a blindness to the vulnerabilities of any project. And those projects are the NIMBYs and the people in the area. If you can't get support from the region, almost every project will struggle, if not fail. So I agree with Steve Sibelius, agree with yourselves that I don't know why they didn't reach out prior to that, but some level of arrogance or misguidance led them to that route. But it showed its failings when the legislature kicked off, and immediately, I think it was the first week of February, we had to send letters in showing our displeasure with the language in the bill and the changes it would do, because they had yet to consult with anyone in the entire region since they had first talked about the project 3 years ago, and it had changed severely since then.
So, Will, I'll ask you the same kind of question I've asked Sarah and Shari is, where do we go from here now, right? Mm-hmm. We've got this letter today. We saw that they're, withdrawing the proposal. As one of the comments in the chat has said, it was wildly unpopular anyway, so it's probably a good thing that they did away with this idea, but it's not done. And that is why I wanted to continue with this show tonight, is to tell our viewers, this isn't over. And if you think this fight is over, you're wrong. This is going to continue. This idea is something that's been percolating around in business's mind for a very long time. Oh, yeah. And we've seen it in other places. We saw it in Korea. We've seen this before with company towns. This is no different. So why does this matter, and why do we have to stay vigilant?
So why this would matter, and some of the things I've said today, the precedent-setting nature of the bill alone, and Section 13 sub F, said basically you didn't have to pre-secure water for your project. If you were rich enough and you could buy water, ultimately your project could be approved. That things like that written into law, whether that bill goes forward or not, could set a precedent going forward that completely changes the outlook of environmental policy, wildlife, anything else across the state. So that's just one example there. But having this project and having the idea of innovation zones going into a study, being thoughtfully, gone through, it was probably the better approach, honestly, because rushing through it during session, trying to do it in a closed down COVID session was not the way to do it, to be frank. So yeah, let's continue the conversation down the road. But when we did get into that continuance, when we did get into these committees of the study, it then reared its head again as being not a sufficiently thought out project for what they ultimately wanted to get, right? Their vision was not prepared for properly, and the pieces they had in place were not ultimately going to fit. The water is 110 miles north of where it needs to be. That is not going to attach itself, right? The plan and the project does have merit, does have some concept that could work, but it did need more work to be more fleshed out. And frankly, that's something that this project needs to figure out going forward, because this is still an individual that owns a significant portion of land in this county. He owns some water rights in the area, and he does have a large business investment in the state. And if he wishes to go forward, I think it's going to be one where it's going to be of collaboration and not of this independent nature. But knowing about these takes and these attempts to have, modern day, as you say, company towns or some other, riff on independent governance is dangerous, because this is America, guys, right? This is a representative democracy, and this is how it works. You elect your people who you want to represent you. They aren't appointed, and they aren't sort of just given their own county. These things usually go the opposite way. You get a population of people together who have an independent nature, and then they become a city, a township, or even a county in some cases. But that is one that is of natural growth usually, and it seemed this was going the backwards way. Want to make a county first and fill with people second. It wasn't really going to work out. So I'm glad we did assess it. We did look at this, and there are some of these concepts that could work in the future, but they need a lot of work, and they need a lot of effort put into them. So I'm glad you guys are looking at it still to this day and keeping your eye on it, because I'm sure we will too, going forward.
Oh yeah, this scam ain't going away. Sarah, I want to bring you back in. You know how I am. I just say it like it is, because it is. To me, this is a scam. I've lived in Nevada my entire life. I'm second generation. Like, hello, I've seen this before. I saw a whole ass stadium built with taxpayer money, even though they said it wasn't taxpayer money. Like, come on. So, Sarah, what is happening now with this interim committee? I know it might be premature to ask that since the letter literally just came to us this afternoon, but does the interim committee move forward? Isn't that kind of now a waste of taxpayer dollars since they've withdrawn the proposal? Like, how does that work now? Do we know?
We don't know. Teresa Benitez Thompson, the chair, she has communicated to us that she's going to talk to LCB and find out how does the committee meet its legislative responsibilities in this, in the legislation without, with consideration for the fact that the primary proponent has withdrawn. But Annette, I want at least one more meeting to make the point as a Nevadan that one of the things this bill really lacked was oversight. The person who is going to approve the application is the director of the Department of Governor's Office of Economic Development. And that's Michael Brown's an excellent guy. He can totally vet an application, but who over 10 years is going to have the oversight to make sure that citizens are protected and they have their rights? That was completely missing from the bill, is that kind of oversight and accountability. So hopefully there will be at least one more meeting where that deficiency in the bill can be brought forward.
Okay, so my last kind of question for all of you is, if a proposal hypothetically were to be brought back and we were to see something move forward, what would be something that might be considered, and what would be a process that would be able to be lived with, right? So for me, I know that, the first and foremost, I think they should probably be consulting tribal governments before they try and move something like this forward, obviously. But also, listening to the people in that county, listening to the people who are elected in that county, listening to Nevadans when we say that we don't think this is a good idea, and maybe talking to some people before they just ram this down our throats. So what would you be looking for in the future if something like this were to be proposed again? And Will, I'll start with you. Shari, I'll move to you, and then Sarah.
Well, honestly, going forward, any concept that hits the state needs to be a well thought out and approachable concept for the whole state. So that's one thing that we didn't really touch on as well, is this was written as a bill, and a bill is a law that is for the entirety of the state. It can't be for a microcosm thing. So going forward, if there's projects like innovation zones, projects like these independent, thought bubbles where somebody wishes to do a sandbox project, I would encourage anybody to honestly look at working with the county and working with local governments in Nevada, because we have very innovative and very, up-to-date local government entities, and check in with them first. And then at all times, any project anywhere should check with your regional, neighbors. And in this case, especially Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe, they are the most essential person at the end of the river there. And they have had the longest fight to do with this river. And Chairwoman Davis, Janet Davis, has been amazing through this whole process and been very graceful in opening up their committee to having a meeting with them later on after the bill was introduced. And even then, that opportunity wasn't fully utilized. So I'd say going forward, you should always work with your regional partners and your regional local governments. And I include Pyramid Lake as one of those governments in this case. So, yep. Good neighbors make good projects. That's all I got to say.
Shari, from kind of an infrastructure point of view, what would you need to see in a future proposal if something like this were to be brought forward?
Well, I think from the district's perspective, it's really important that the district governance and operations remain intact and not really, taken over by an outside entity. Our job right now is to help our existing customers be successful, and we just want to have that certainty that we can continue to do our job. I think another important issue is regional water resource planning. The district's philosophy is to collaborate with the folks that rely on the groundwater in our basin and the Truckee River water resources, and try to leverage the resource for the benefit of everyone. And I think that was really sort of missing here. And I think in general, just a collaborative process from the get-go. I'm an engineer, so I think that, there are no technical problems that we can't solve. But we've got to get together in a really open, transparent way and have those conversations early on. I think you always get a better product when you're open to new ideas. And there was really sort of the innovation zone legislation, I think, sort of set up a little bit more of a silo system. And we know that that's not the best way to get a good product. So those would be the three things I would like to see that would different under different circumstances.
So, Annette, I'll pick that up. And I work a lot in affordable housing, in education and behavioral health. Those are my interests and also areas that I represent clients. And I am a proponent of big ideas, but big ideas have to get all the way to the ground and address fundamental needs of Nevadans, such as housing, such as education, such as healthcare. So big changes, big ideas in our state are welcome, but we need to really make sure they get all the way to the ground and are working with people at a grassroots level to figure out what are appropriate collaborations to enable a big idea and at the same time help the Nevadans who are push that idea forward.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sarah. All right. Any final thoughts before we wrap up tonight? Any final words that you want to leave our viewers with about future proposals that they need to be watching for?
I think you've done a great job covering it. You've been a great voice throughout this whole process. Anyone who hasn't seen Annette in a committee room, you should. Everybody knows that she's there and that she's standing up for Nevadans. So thanks for this opportunity.
Yeah, no, I'm always there to run my mouth, Sarah, never fear. All right. Well, thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. And thank you to our viewers at home. I really think that this proposal has not seen the end of its life. It will come back in some other form. And so I encourage all of you to be vigilant about this. This is a scam. And this is something that, they were trying to skirt the rules and not have to talk to the necessary people to get this done. And to me, I'm a rule follower. I think that we should all have to follow the same set of rules, and that includes business and government. And so it's a fairness issue, and it's an issue about making sure that we're protecting people's water, making sure that we're protecting our tribal communities, and making sure that we're protecting our lands, because at the end of the day, that's our job. And so, I know that many people in the legislature didn't always love what I had to say on innovation zones, but at the end of the day, I'm going to call it like I see it. And my dad always taught me, and I said this in committee when I testified, and I'll say it again. If something's too good to be true, it usually is. And this was one of those times where, the hair kind of stood up on the back of my neck and was, this was too good to be true. And I'm sorry, I just don't think a billionaire is going to solve all our problems. I think we actually need to take a real approach at raising real revenue in this state and talk about long-term sustainable investments in things like our education system and our healthcare system and our housing issues. And having a billionaire come solve your problems, it's never worked before in Nevada, and it's not going to work this time. And so anytime somebody feeds you that line, it's probably bullshit. So I just want to leave you with that. If you think something is too good to be true, you should call it out as well. And that's what we will continue to do on this issue. So I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I want to thank you for staying vigilant on the issue of innovation zones. And again, just because this proposal was withdrawn doesn't mean this fight is over, and we're in this for the long haul. So thank you all for joining us. Continue wearing your masks. COVID is real, everyone. Believe in science. Go get your booster if it's available to you. And we will see you next week. Have a great evening, everyone. Stay safe.